The lobby of the Fontaine Hotel was marble and crystal, and old Southern money. Ella Fitzgerald stood at the reception desk, her road manager beside her, confirmation letter in hand. The reservation had been made weeks ago. Paid in advance. Everything proper and legal and arranged. The desk clerk looked at the reservation, looked at Ella, looked back at the reservation. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to something else. Something Ella had seen 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry," he said, his southern accent dripping with false politeness. "There seems to be a mistake. We don't have a room available for you." "The reservation is right there," Ella's manager said, pointing to the confirmation letter the clerk was holding. "Prepaid. Confirmed 2 weeks ago." "I understand," the clerk said, not looking at Ella now. "But we're fully booked. There's been an error. Perhaps you can find accommodations elsewhere." Ella stood very still. She was 37 years old. She'd just performed to a sold-out audience of 3,000 people. Her name was on marquees. Her records sold in the hundreds of thousands. She was Ella Fitzgerald, and this man was telling her she couldn't have a room in a hotel that had confirmed her reservation because the color of her skin made her unwelcome. Behind her, the white members of her orchestra were being checked in without incident. Room keys handed over with smiles. Luggage being collected by porters. Everything running smoothly for everyone, except the woman whose name was on all the tickets, whose voice had filled the auditorium 2 hours ago. "I'll wait here," Ella said quietly. The clerk looked confused. "Ma'am, I have a reservation. I'm not leaving. I'll wait here in your lobby until you find the room that was reserved for me." And she walked to one of the plush chairs in the hotel lobby, sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. This is the story of what happened during those 6 hours. Of what Ella Fitzgerald's quiet, dignified refusal to leave set in motion. Of how a hotel's racist policy collided with one woman's determination to be treated with the basic respect she'd earned 1,000 times over. The year was 1954. And the American South was a minefield for black performers. Jim Crow laws made segregation legal and systematic. Signs declaring whites only hung over water fountains, restaurants, hotel lobbies. The best venues would let black artists perform, would take their money and their talent, but wouldn't let them stay in the same hotels as white patrons. Ella Fitzgerald had navigated this reality her entire professional life. Performed in cities where she couldn't eat in most restaurants. Slept on tour buses because hotels refused her. Used colored-only facilities, while white audiences applauded her artistry. The contradiction was exhausting, enraging, but refusing to perform in the South meant giving up half the country's venues. Usually, her management tried to arrange accommodations in advance at black-owned establishments, or in the colored sections of town. But the Fontaine Hotel had taken the reservation without question. The name Ella Fitzgerald carried weight. They'd accepted the booking, accepted the payment, confirmed everything in writing. What they hadn't expected was that Ella Fitzgerald would actually try to check in, that she wouldn't quietly accept being redirected elsewhere, that she'd sit in their pristine white marble lobby and refuse to move. The first hour was quiet. Ella sat in the chair, hands folded, expression calm. Her road manager, Tommy Walsh, stood nearby, furious, but following Ella's lead. A few members of her orchestra lingered in the lobby, uncertain what to do. Eventually most went to their rooms, exhausted from the show and the travel. But 3 stayed. Her pianist, Paul Smith. Her bassist, Joe Comfort. Her drummer, Alvin Stoller. All white men who could have gone to their rooms without incident. Who could have pretended not to notice the indignity being inflicted on the woman they worked for. Instead, they sat in the lobby chairs near Ella, a silent statement of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by the hotel staff or the other guests passing through. The desk clerk called the manager. A man named Richard Hartwell appeared, Southern gentleman, mid-50s, impeccably dressed. He approached Ella with the kind of condescending courtesy that barely masked contempt. "Miss Fitzgerald," he said, "I understand there's been some confusion. Perhaps we can help you find suitable accommodations elsewhere in town. I have a reservation here," Ella said calmly. "Confirmed and paid for." I'd like the room I reserved. I'm afraid that's not possible, Hartwell said. We have certain policies. I'm sure you understand. I understand that you confirmed a reservation and accepted payment, Ella said. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the elegant lobby. Other guests were starting to notice the confrontation. What I don't understand is why my money was good enough when you didn't know what I looked like, but not good enough now that I'm standing here. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Miss Fitzgerald, I don't appreciate your tone. This is a private establishment. We reserve the right to refuse service. Then refund my money and put it in writing that the Fontaine Hotel refuses service to Ella Fitzgerald because she's a Negro, Ella said. I'm sure that will make interesting reading in the newspapers. The manager's expression shifted. The threat of publicity was real. Ella Fitzgerald wasn't just any traveler. She was famous. If word got out that a prestigious hotel had refused her despite a confirmed reservation, it would be a story. Maybe not one that would change hearts in the Deep South, but one that would embarrass the Fontaine Hotel in circles that mattered. I'll need to make some calls, Hartwell said, retreating to the back office. Ella settled deeper into her chair. 2 hours now. Still waiting. Paul Smith, her pianist, came over. Ella, this is ridiculous. Let me go find you a decent place. You don't have to sit here and take this. Yes, I do, Ella said. If I leave, they win. They get to keep pretending their policy is about standards and not about the color of someone's skin. I'm tired of making it easy for them. Joe Comfort brought her a glass of water from the fountain, the White's only fountain, making a deliberate point. A hotel porter looked like he wanted to object, then thought better of it. The lobby of the Fontaine Hotel continued its usual evening business around Ella's protest. Guests checked in, collected their keys, headed to the elevator. Some glanced at Ella curiously. A few with obvious disapproval. One older white woman stopped and stared openly, as if Ella's presence in the lobby was an affront to decency. But some looked at her with something else. Discomfort, maybe. Recognition that something wrong was happening. A young white couple checking in looked at Ella, at the 3 white musicians sitting near her in solidarity, at the manager's office where Richard Hartwell was presumably still making his calls. The young man said something to the desk clerk that made him flush and look away. 3 hours. Ella had been sitting in the lobby for 3 hours. Her back ached. Her feet hurt. She was still wearing the heels from the performance. She was exhausted from the show, from the travel, from the constant weight of navigating a country that celebrated her artistry while denying her humanity. But she didn't move. Didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her leave defeated. Tommy Walsh brought her a sandwich from somewhere outside the hotel. No restaurant in the Fontaine would serve her, even as she sat in their lobby. She ate it slowly, dignified, refusing to be diminished by the absurdity of eating a sandwich in an evening gown in a hotel lobby because the hotel restaurant wouldn't let her through the door. Around the 4th hour, something started to shift. Word had spread through the hotel. Guests were talking. Some of the older white Southerners were complaining. How dare this woman sit in the lobby like she belonged here? But others, younger guests, a few businessmen from the North were asking different questions. Why was Ella Fitzgerald sitting in the lobby? Why hadn't she been given a room? Hadn't they taken her money? One guest, a music journalist from New York, recognized her immediately, approached her with a combination of respect and outrage. Miss Fitzgerald, what's happening here? Ella explained calmly. The reservation, the confirmation, the refusal. The journalist's expression hardened. May I write about this? Please do, Ella said. The journalist went directly to make phone calls. Within 30 minutes, other press started arriving. A local reporter, a photographer. Suddenly, the Fontaine Hotel's quiet discrimination was becoming a public spectacle. Richard Hartwell emerged from his office looking far less composed than before. The presence of press changed everything. This wasn't just an internal hotel matter anymore. This was a story that would be in tomorrow's papers. Miss Fitzgerald, he said, his tone different now. Less condescending, more calculating. I believe we've located your room. There was indeed a clerical error. My apologies for the confusion. 6 hours. Ella said quietly. It took you 6 hours to find a room that was confirmed and paid for 2 weeks ago. As I said, a clerical error. We both know what kind of error it was, Ella said. She stood slowly, every movement deliberate and dignified. I'll take my room now. And I expect my colleagues to be treated with the same courtesy every other guest receives. Hartwell handed her a room key himself, unwilling to delegate this task to the desk clerk who'd started the situation. Of course, Miss Fitzgerald. My sincere apologies for the inconvenience. Ella took the key, looked at the 3 musicians who'd sat with her for 6 hours. Thank you, she said simply. They nodded, understanding what those 6 hours had meant, what they'd witnessed. As she walked to the elevator, every person in that lobby was watching. Some with resentment, some with curiosity, some with something that might have been shame. But Ella Fitzgerald had her room, had stood her ground and won, not through anger or demands, but through quiet, persistent refusal to accept indignity. The story of those 6 hours at the Fontaine Hotel spread quickly. The music journalist from New York wrote a piece that ran in major papers. The local press covered it, some sympathetically, some defensively, trying to minimize what had happened. But the facts were clear. A world-famous artist had been denied a room she'd paid for because of her race, and she'd refused to quietly disappear. What happened next surprised everyone, including Ella. The Fontaine Hotel received letters. Lots of them. Some from angry Southerners defending segregation, but many from people who were embarrassed. Businessmen who stayed at the Fontaine when traveling south. Music industry professionals who'd attended the concert and heard about the incident. Even some local residents who felt the hotel had brought shame to their city. But the most impactful response came from somewhere unexpected. The white musicians who toured with Ella, not just the 3 who'd sat with her, but others who worked with her regularly, started making it clear that they wouldn't perform at venues or stay at hotels that discriminated against their black colleagues. Paul Smith, her pianist, wrote a letter to Downbeat magazine. I've had the privilege of performing with Ella Fitzgerald for 3 years. She's not just the greatest vocalist I've ever worked with. She's one of the finest musicians alive, regardless of instrument or genre. The Fontaine Hotel treated her like a second-class citizen, and until they change their policies, I won't set foot in their establishment again. Other musicians echoed the sentiment. Joe Comfort, Alvin Stoller. Then musicians who hadn't been there but heard about it. Frank Sinatra, who'd worked with Ella, sent a telegram to the Fontaine Hotel's management. Any establishment that treats Ella Fitzgerald with anything less than the utmost respect doesn't deserve her patronage or mine. Within 3 months, the Fontaine Hotel quietly changed its policies. Not because they'd had a change of heart about race. Richard Hartwell remained exactly who he'd always been. But because economics proved more persuasive than morality. Losing the business of touring musicians, losing the respect of the music industry, risking their reputation with northern businessmen who stayed there during southern trips, it was costing them money. The new policy was carefully worded to avoid explicitly mentioning race, but the meaning was clear. Confirmed reservations would be honored regardless of the guest's background. Ella Fitzgerald returned to that city 2 years later for another performance. Her management deliberately booked her at the Fontaine Hotel again. A test, maybe. A statement, certainly. This time, there was no incident. The desk clerk checked her in promptly. The room key was handed over with professional courtesy. No one made her wait in the lobby for 6 hours. But Ella never forgot those 6 hours. And she never let others forget either. In interviews for years afterward, when asked about civil rights and discrimination, she would talk about that night. I didn't plan to sit there for 6 hours, she'd say. I was tired. I wanted to go to bed. But I realized that if I left, if I made it easy for them, nothing would change. Someone had to be inconvenient. Someone had to refuse to disappear quietly. The 3 musicians who'd stayed with her, Paul Smith, Joe Comfort, Alvin Stoller, became lifelong friends. Their decision to sit in that lobby, to give up the comfort of their rooms to stand with her in silent solidarity, meant more to Ella than they could have known. They didn't have to stay, she said in a 1960 interview at Hawaii. They could have gone upstairs, gotten a good night's sleep, pretended not to notice what was happening. But they stayed. And that kind of allyship, that willingness to share the discomfort instead of benefiting from the privilege, that's what actually changes things. The story of the Fontaine Hotel lobby became a quiet legend in music circles. Not as famous as the larger battles of the civil rights movement, no dramatic confrontations, no violence, no arrests. Just one woman sitting in a chair for 6 hours, refusing to accept being treated as less than human. But that quiet resistance mattered. Every musician who'd heard about it, who'd seen a peer refuse to tolerate discrimination, became a little more willing to speak up themselves. Every venue that worried about losing performers started reconsidering their policies. Every hotel that watched the Fontaine's reputation take a hit understood that discrimination had consequences. Ella Fitzgerald didn't single-handedly desegregate Southern hotels. That would take federal legislation and years of sustained activism. But she made her small corner of the world slightly better. Made it harder for businesses to maintain racist policies without facing public accountability. Made it clear that talent and fame didn't mean accepting indignity with a smile. The Fontaine Hotel stands to this day in that southern city. Under different ownership now. Different policies. A different era. On their website, they mention their history of hosting famous performers. They list Ella Fitzgerald among the luminaries who've stayed there. They don't mention the 6 hours she spent in the lobby before they'd give her a room. Don't acknowledge the discrimination or the protest or the quiet courage it took to refuse to leave. But people who know the story remember. Musicians who've heard it from their mentors. Music historians who've researched that era. And every time someone books a room at the Fontaine Hotel without being turned away because of their race, Ella Fitzgerald's 6 hours in that lobby matter. Because that's how change happens. Not always through dramatic gestures or famous speeches. Sometimes through one exhausted woman sitting in a hotel lobby chair, folding her hands in her lap, and saying simply, "I'll wait." 6 hours that felt like forever. 6 hours that changed a hotel's policies. 6 hours that proved quiet dignity could be more powerful than rage. 6 hours that reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most revolutionary act is refusing to accept what injustice declares inevitable. Ella Fitzgerald was tired that night. Wanted nothing more than to sleep after a long performance and longer travel. But instead of sleeping, she sat in the lobby and waited. And in waiting, she won. Not just a room. Anyone could have found her different accommodations. She won something far more important. The right to exist in spaces that tried to exclude her. The satisfaction of forcing a discriminatory system to bend rather than disappearing quietly. The proof that one person's refusal to accept indignity could create ripples that changed policies and inspired others. Those 6 hours in the Fontaine Hotel lobby weren't about convenience or comfort. They were about standing ground, quite literally sitting ground, and refusing to make someone else's racism easier to maintain by removing yourself from spaces you had every right to occupy. Every time Ella told the story afterward, she'd end the same way. I was just tired of leaving. Tired of being the one who had to go somewhere else, find something else, accept less. So I didn't leave. I sat there. And eventually, they had to do the right thing. Not because they wanted to, but because I made it harder to do the wrong thing. That's the legacy of those 6 hours. Not that Ella Fitzgerald changed every heart or fixed every injustice, but that she refused to make injustice convenient. She made discrimination visible, uncomfortable, costly. She sat in that lobby and forced everyone who passed through to see what they'd been pretending not to notice. And 6 hours later, when they finally gave her the room she'd paid for, she'd won more than a night's accommodation. She'd won a precedent. A story. Why? A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to leave spaces where people want you gone. The marble lobby. The crystal chandelier. And two, and one guy. It's going easy under bloody child. The plush chairs. Ella Fitzgerald sat there for 6 hours and changed what that space meant. Made it a place where her dignity trumped their prejudice, where her persistence outlasted their discrimination, and every person who sat in solidarity, every journalist who wrote about it, every musician who heard the story and decided to take their own stands, Every hotel manager who realized discrimination could hurt their bottom line. Every small victory that came afterward, they all traced back to those 6 hours. 6 hours in a hotel lobby, one woman refusing to disappear, and a lesson that resonated for decades. You don't have to fight every battle with raised fists. Sometimes you fight by sitting down and refusing to move until justice has no choice but to show up.